And welcome back. The family of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu has filed papers seeking leave to appeal the Gauteng High Court judgment that ordered the repatriation of Lungu's remains back to his country for burial. Lungu died in June in Johannesburg after an illness. The Zambian government and the family of the late president have been embroiled in a legal battle over his remains and burial. His family wanted him to be buried in South Africa, and for the current president, Hakainde Hichilema, neither to attend his funeral nor be involved in his arrangements. But the Zambian government went to court to stop him from being buried in South Africa. Our reporter has been following this story. Canny Maphanga now joins us for more. Kenny, this is really a very interesting case because it begs the question, and as the court had to grapple with, at least in the Gauteng High Court, is who the rightful owner, so to speak, is in this case. And what the court found there was that the country had claim to the remains of former President Lungu, and not necessarily only exclusively his family. What does the family say to that in response, in appeal?
Well, indeed, Oliver, if we look at the two grounds that the court relied on, that is the full bench of the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria, they relied on the fact that there was an enforceable agreement between the two parties, that is the Lungu family and the Zambian government. You may remember that the genesis of this issue saw a repatriation getting underway, and it was stopped abruptly when the family learned that the body would be received by the current Zambian head of state, which is President Hakainde Hichilema. Then they announced that there would be a private burial. Then, of course, there's also that issue of Zambian interests, because the application was brought in terms of Zambia's laws, their constitution, Section 177, which deals with the public interests and acting in the best interests of Zambia and its people. And it is against that backdrop that the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria reached a conclusion that the personal wishes of the Lungu family cannot outweigh the public interest of Zambia and its nation. And they reached a conclusion that he should be repatriated back to Zambia to be for the purposes of a state funeral and a burial. Of course, the family takes great issue with that, stating that their wishes are final and should be respected. So now we have two appeals filed in the Gauteng High Court and the Constitutional Court. In the midst of that, there's also discussions between the family and the Zambian government and their lawyers to see if they can resolve this outside of the court. We'll find out on Monday what the conclusion to that will be, and if there'll finally be a resolution, because he passed away in June. It's been, I think, over 2 months now that his remains have been sitting in the mortuary while the different parties try to resolve this contentious issue.
On the second part of the case, or at least the second argument the court had relied on there, I want us to zoom in a little bit, because counsel for the Lungu family made the argument that the family's wishes are merely an extension of what was the dying wishes of President Lungu, and that his dying wish was for Hichilema to not at all be involved in this. How did the court evaluate that?
Again, they evaluated it according to Zambian law, and because this was a public interest litigation that was brought by the Zambian government, they relied on Section 177 of their constitution, which places the Zambian public interests as supreme to the issues that are being discussed. So we have seen the arguments being bantered about that he was an ordinary citizen, according to the family, and that his last dying wish was that he wanted to be buried in South Africa. But the Zambian government had argued that this was a Zambian citizen. He had only arrived in South Africa for the purposes of a medical intervention. He passed away prior to that medical intervention being complete, and that he always had the intention to go back to Zambia, where he, along with most of his family members, are domiciled because they are Zambian citizens. The Zambian law was applied, and that is how the court reached that conclusion, that the public interest must outweigh the personal wishes of the family. But of course, the family doesn't agree to that law being applied to this particular matter. But in the same breath, when you heard those arguments, to me, listening inside the court, it appeared that the only impediment that stood in the way for the Zambian government to realize they wish to lay their former president to rest in his homeland was this issue of the current president presiding over the state funeral and the burial. Now, the meaning of presiding is what is ambiguous for most parties here. We don't know what the family means when they say that they don't want the head of state presiding over that funeral. In addition, the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria did not rule on that emotive issue, so the family has no guarantee that if it were to go ahead, that this impediment would fall away or not. And of course, without that guarantee, that is why you keep seeing this issue of the appeals going ahead and the parties failing to find one another on these issues, because those negotiations in that regard seem to have fallen flat between the two parties.
How did the litigation play itself out on that technical question of domicile? I would imagine that it was quite contentious, the question around what part of the law is applicable here, especially when it comes to, the interest of the Zambian people, and you have South African judges presiding over that. Because ultimately, what the case that was brought to them was a repatriation case.
Yes.
And they were meant to adjudicate only on the question, primarily, of repatriation, where the law on that is seemingly very clear. And as you pointed out, what complicated it, at least for the Lungu family there, is that there was a standing agreement before they decided to withhold or at least to pull out from the repatriation process. How did the court draw the line between what it adjudicates and what it doesn't adjudicate, particularly around the question of what law gets applied, or South African law or Zambian law?
Well, I think it was quite simple for the court because it was a public interest litigation. They found that the former president is a Zambian citizen. He's not a South African citizen, and that the Zambian laws and its public policy was closest to the issue. So it became apparent and appropriate to process or evaluate this matter in terms of Zambian law, not South African law. It is against that backdrop that they reached the conclusion that the interests of the nation must come first, and he must be repatriated back to Zambia for the purposes of a state funeral and a burial.
Yeah, and so the argument for leave to appeal will be heard. Will it be decided on the papers, or will it be our parties asked to make oral representations?
Well, leave to appeal has already been filed in both courts. You remember on Friday, the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria, the full bench there, was set to hear the leave to appeal to the first court regarding that issue. But when they arrived at court, it became clear that there was some form of discussions between the two parties that may, if successful, dissolve this matter in that particular court. But if not, we'll hear tomorrow if that is the case, then the parties will have to proceed with that leave to appeal. Now, because of the way that our courts are designed, there are several other courts you would have to go through in order to complete an appeals process if it's not successful, meaning that it would be quite a lengthy process to go through. So we've seen that.
So first to the full bench before the Supreme Court?
Yes, and then we also have the Constitutional Court, which is now the highest court in the land. So because of that issue, the family has now filed the direct appeal to the Constitutional Court, because remember, you are dealing with the remains of the former president that have been in that mortuary for some time now. If you wait for that appeals process to be completed, it may not be in the interest of justice to wait that long in order to lay him to
So there is an element of urgency, and both parties can argue that.
It's quite an urgent issue that they need to resolve quite quickly. So it explains why there's now this leave to appeal in the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria. Then they've also filed in the Constitutional Court for direct appeal.
Yeah. Another case that's in court this week is the return, or at least the appearance tomorrow, of former parliamentary speaker Nosiviwe Mapisa-Maqula. Take us to what the facts of that case are and what's happening in court tomorrow.
So the former speaker of the National Assembly, she's facing quite serious charges relating to corruption during her tenure as Minister of Defence. She was allegedly implicated by a defence contractor in the misappropriation of funds to the tune of millions. The difficulty with that case is that since it has been transferred from the lower court to the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria for trial, there have been several delays that have stunted the beginning of this trial. And it has been quite frustrating for the presiding officer to have to keep putting this matter on the roll and hearing postponements and et cetera, et cetera. We saw her get arrested or hand herself over in the full glare of cameras last year. And we heard the ID go on and on about how they have such a strong case. However, since that moment last year, there have been several delays in the High Court, which hasn't seen any movement in this particular case. So tomorrow's date is for the purposes of getting a progress report from the IG regarding where this matter is heading. So we'll see tomorrow how that plays out in the court, but we haven't seen much movement in this particular matter since that high-profile first appearance that we saw in the lower court last year.
Yeah, Kenny, thank you so much for that. Really do appreciate it. Kenny Maphanga giving us an update of what's happening in the courts, particularly tomorrow with the appearance of the Lungu family and getting some sense of whether or not the appeal will happen in the Gauteng High Court or if it will happen in the Constitutional Court